we have a very impressive panel of speakers for you. I'll introduce them each as they speak. The first is Dr. Omar El-Hamdoon. He's president of the Muslim Association of Britain and one of the assistant secretary generals of the Muslim Council of Britain. I know him as somebody that I've interviewed frequently and as an articulate and clear defender of the Muslim community. So please welcome him.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin by praising Allah and sending salutation and praise to his final messenger. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session, and I'm quite honored to be here addressing you about this topic. Now, this topic has been divided into a number of sections. I'm going to be looking at a critical view of the origins of the Muslim Brotherhood and its evolution. That in itself probably is enough to be a title for a thesis. So 10 minutes, I think, to say the least, is injustice. But I'll just make some pointers. Now, I think without doubt, if we're going to look at something like origins and history, it is something that we look at history. We need to understand origins and evolution. And as Michael Crichton said, if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. If we consider that the Muslim Brotherhood as a social movement, then as Smelser, the psychologist, said, then something like a social movement actually usually comes about from an initiating event. Now, this initiating event may be something which is dramatic. It may be like a one-incident event. We saw something like, for example, the Arab Spring, starting with someone, Bouazizi, burning himself, letting himself and setting himself to fire. That was like a very sort of spontaneous event. But also there can be events which can happen throughout the world, or maybe the whole climax can actually result in a movement like this starting. And if we look at the Muslim Brotherhood, the climax, or the context of what was happening in the world at that time, especially in that region, was that there was the dismantlement of the Islamic Caliphate, which was there. It was providing a shelter and almost like a shield for the Muslim community. Whether it was dismantled by Muslims or whether it was by non-Muslims, that's probably a deeper debate to have. But that was one of the things that was happening there. At the same time, there were colonizing European powers in most of the Middle East and Africa and extending into India. These colonizers were probably seen as non-Muslims who have come and maybe an extension of earlier crusades. So those are the kind of things that were happening there, and that's why the Muslim Brotherhood, when it came out with this kind of pretext to give solutions and to try and solve some of the issues that were there. And I think we look at these kind of things happening even with different aspects of change, whether it was Martin Luther King in America or Nelson Mandela, is that these kind of movements try to give solutions to society. I think Hassan al-Banna, when he came about back in the late 1920s to set up this movement, was to provide that solution, to try and address that solution. And therefore, this link that further it has with this movement being linked to Islam, I think also means that there was ultimately the link to the historical aspect of how Islam came about. So even extending back into how Islam started off with the Prophet Muhammad, his mission in changing, providing solutions, and so on. So you can't really, I think, you can't really distinct the two. That kind of has that aspirations back very much rooted in the historical context of what Islam came about. And so therefore, when you look at how Islam initially came about with this kind of ethos of altruism and civic duty and trying to help people and providing social justice, is very much something that we can see as well linked to what ultimately is a religious movement. So that's a little bit about, the origin. When you look therefore at after that, which is the evolution of the movement, then obviously it is quite evident, without doubt, that there is evolution, and that again is related to another principle which Fadi Hattendorf mentions, that modern society becomes more and more complex by the day, and what used to be tradition isn't necessarily tradition anymore. And I think this is true for many things, that something that was there in the early 20th century, dealing with the whole context, is much different than what is happening now in the 21st century. So without doubt, people who were living that time and are living this time would have had to evolve in how the world dynamics needed to evolve, in terms of the context, in terms of this whole aspect of what was accepted at one time, to go and just attack a country and colonize it and put your puppets there. This is all changed now, and so without doubt the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization and as a movement has gone through evolution. Again, a concept which is probably quite deep-rooted in Islam, something which we call tajdeed, something which is the renewal. Even the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, mentioned about this concept of maybe every century there will arise someone who actually tries to renew aspects of the religion, because any practice, any ideology, any theology, it doesn't have that renewing aspect in it, will without doubt become by its very nature outdated. So when you look at how the Brotherhood has dealt with certain issues, obviously it went through a period of being part of the society, helping in actually bringing social cohesion in Egypt, but then it almost had to deal with other issues when it started to becoming clear conflict with the government at that time, during Nasser's time, for example, when he accused them of trying to assassinate him, and then obviously they were put in prisons, and that in itself caused a new breed of thinking, which gave rise to Sayyid Qutb's thoughts and probably his more revolutionary style thoughts. But then the Muslim Brotherhood also was quick to move on from that, so not allowing that kind of system to engulf the movement. So that in itself was an evolution. But you see, the evolution was also wider than that, because the Muslim Brotherhood was never really confined to Egypt. It did spread out as it reached out to other Arab and Muslim countries, and even as members of the Muslim Brotherhood came to live in the West and in Europe, they took with them those ideologies and those ideals that they had, and brought it into trying to make use of this kind of social reviving movement to participate in the society that they have. And so even within in Europe today and Western today, I mean, even funny enough, somebody was tweeting that this conference, that we will be making sure that we stop you from implementing and succeeding in implementing Sharia law in Britain. This was a kind of tweet that's related. And I replied to the guy, I said to him, well, actually we'll work together then, because we're not here to implement Sharia law. And that's the kind of, actually that in a way shows of how Muslims who have come in Britain have understand that this kind of evolution is that, yes, there is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt maybe, or in other Arab countries where there's a Muslim majority, that Sharia law is an option. And even then, through democracy, through voting, which probably again shows the evolution of accepting the systems that are changing in the world. But those who came in the West, like as I was saying, were accepting that their ideals, if you like, the Muslim Brotherhood ideology or ideals, were there for the betterment of society. But unfortunately, even if you read like books of Vidino, and you see that he actually mentions the responses of Western thinkers are even mixed about this. They are the optimists who say, okay, these are people who are going to really, they are there to give good things for society, and they are working for change, and they are working to help. But then there are the pessimists who unfortunately accuse anyone who is trying to work for change as a form of Trojan horse and just using democracy to somehow get into power in Downing Street and then enforce a Sharia-like coup on the rest of Britain. So I think without doubt that the past century, this 90 years or so, the Muslim Brotherhood has evolved to try and promote. And I think the challenge that obviously part of this conference is to try and address is that there is a fear out there for one reason, but I think also there is some sort of not just a maybe an unexplained fear or phobia, but there's actually probably a calculated fear that what is known as political Islam, which to me doesn't make sense anyway, is that actually it is something where almost an event trying to silence anybody who wants to speak. And this is something that we're seeing today. We're seeing how people speaking against Zionism are actually trying to be equated with anti-Semitism. People who want to maybe now criticize the government may actually be very easily tarnished as extremists with this new counter-terrorism bill, and so on and so forth. So it's almost a feeling of trying to sign this bill. So there's still a lot of more work to be done in trying to contextualize the changes and to try and make them more relevant to the world today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Omar. And now it's a pleasure to introduce Victoria Brittain to you. Victoria Brittain has a distinguished career as a foreign editor on The Guardian. She was the co-author of Mozambique's book, Enemy Combatant. I've known her for a long time as a stalwart campaigner, both on the question of Palestine and against the war. Please welcome Victoria Brittain.
Thank you, John. Well, it's... Oh, I meant to put it on. Sorry. I can say this bit without the mic. It's a real pleasure to be here. Is the mic okay now? And I'm extremely happy that this conference has been organised, which I expect to learn a lot from it. Now, in the first session this morning, there was a lot of discussion about how important it is to differentiate between different bits of political Islam. In discussion with my colleague Dr. Daud, I'd already decided that I would speak about Hamas rather than the Muslim Brotherhood itself, because of course Hamas had its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, and it grew out of a social project motivated by philanthropy and dedicated to charity. As you probably know, the Ikhwan in Palestine opened a few local branches in Gaza immediately after World War II. So it's from that kind of history that I'm going to move towards the now, because of course the now is, as Anas reminded us, that Hamas is designated as a terror organization by the United Kingdom and the United States and the European Union. Now, I've spent much of my working life as a journalist living in Africa, in countries completely scarred by the effects of colonialism, British, French, and Portuguese, and then later by neocolonialism under kind of American, Western in general, but particularly US-led. And among my indelible experiences of living in, for the French, Algeria, DRC, Rwanda, Burkina Faso, and for Britain, Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, Ghana, and South Africa, and for Portugal, Angola, were repeating patterns. And these are some of the things that are in the patterns: assassination of nationalist leaders, exile, imprisonment, coups, political and economic support for deeply corrupt anti-nationalist leaders. And in the case of Angola, the running of proxy wars that completely destroyed the country's infrastructure and terrorized the population, who largely became refugees or displaced people in their own country. Now, my second visit to Gaza was in 2002 at the invitation of the late and great Dr. Ayad Sarraj. And I happened to arrive immediately after the targeted assassination of Salah Shehadeh with 15 civilians. And I saw there in Gaza, it was as though every one of the experiences I had known in these colonial countries over 30 years was completely condensed in this tiny place, in what people were living through and had lived through in Gaza. So what was it that made this tiny place such a perceived threat to the world's most powerful? Well, one thing was a successful populist social movement, but linked, of course, to resistance against the Israeli occupation. And for shorthand, I'm going to call that nationalism, because we're having a lot of struggle with political Islam. But of course, you have to add on to a nationalist project the words political Islam, a kind of taboo. But before I come on to say more about Gaza and Hamas, I just want to mention two people who I wish could have been here with us today. And their experiences just in this very last week completely epitomize something that happened to them both in the United States. And I've described it as a colonial style ignorance, stupidity, and racism, which is certainly unfit for the 21st century. Now, these two people are Muslim men with nationalist credentials in their whole lives. And they fell victim to the political and judicial system of the United States. One name I'm sure is known to all of you, Professor Sami Al-Arian, a highly respected Palestinian intellectual who was deported from the US to Turkey last week after an outrageous, long drawn-out trial for terrorism, but actually it was for criticizing Israel and backing Palestinian rights in an amazingly effective way. The second person you may not know, but as he had spent years living in Britain with refugee status after a long period of torture as an opponent of the Mubarak regime. He's a lawyer, human rights lawyer called Daud Abdullah. And he was forced Friday of last week to accept a 25-year plea bargain in a case which should never have been brought, as he was completely innocent of the accusation of a role in the Al-Qaeda East African US Embassy bombings of 1998. But anyway, they're not with us, but they're in our minds, because both of these are a kind of manifestation of what happens to careless use of the phrase political Islam. So I want to go back to Gaza quickly. Gaza was the fulcrum of Palestinian nationalism after 1948, when 200,000 Palestinians fled into Gaza, which had a population of 80,000 at that time. That meant a quarter of the Palestinians were actually living in Gaza, and all the rest were under either Jordanian or Israeli rule. In Gaza, the PLO and the PLA were created, and Fedayeen trained in Egypt were crossed back into Gaza and formed the first armed resistance to the first Israeli occupation. Now, as you all know, Israel has spent more than half a century in escalating violence against Palestinian nationalism in both Gaza and the West Bank. And that Israeli violence escalated in response to the challenge of resistance, which was espoused by Hamas during the first Intifada. There were hundreds of Hamas arrests and deportations to Lebanon. And at that point, the Palestinian Ikhwan moved its leadership out of the territory for safety. And that is still the situation today, as you know. And at the same time, you had the PLO and Fatah leaders who entered what I think of as just the cul-de-sac of the Oslo peace process, which has for 25 years given Israel the cover to redraw the geography of the West Bank and the isolation of Gaza. And all that has been about killing Palestinian nationalism. So I was to take up the theme of what does Hamas, in my case, offer to the modern world. I'm going to give you two things. The first are the terrible lessons of how a 21st century colonial response can be as violent and illegal as anything the great colonial empires of Britain, France, and Portugal did in the 18th and the 19th and 20th centuries in Africa and Asia. These are my 7 points, which will be very brief. Hamas won a democratic election and as a result was cut off from relations with the Western world, including most aid. Hamas had a coup planned against them within their own security forces by outsiders. 3, Gaza was put under a virtual trade and fishing blockade for years. There were 5 years in which they saw 363 targeted assassinations of their best cadres. This was when Ariel Sharon was the prime minister, including in quick succession 2 of their leaders, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Abdel Aziz Rantisi. Then they were designated a hostile entity, which deepened, of course, the isolation and the stigmatization. At the same time, they saw their country, Palestine, split into 2, not to speak of the time and again attacks on the population from land, sea, and air. But here's the upbeat. This is the other example that Hamas offers a 20th century which is ruled by the neoliberalism and the idea that there is no alternative. Now, social welfare programs have always been the bedrock of Hamas's popular support and its respect and gratitude among the most deprived. As Western governments impose austerity, telling them there's no alternative, increasingly in Latin America, just such alternative social welfare models are in action, and actually they're starting in Southern Europe. So in the context of this spreading resistance to neocolonial economics, what Latin America has seen is the old pattern: Western-supported attempted coups, ongoing destabilization of nationalist leaders, as in Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Meanwhile, in the popular movements of, for instance, the MST Landesworkers in Brazil, or South African workers' challenge to the ANC government, the Hamas's example of courage and of organization during last year's Israeli offensive in particular is celebrated as a popular national success. So Hamas has shown that resistance in different ways, intellectually and actually, is possible. Their military organization took Israel completely by surprise last summer. And despite the terrible death toll, the offensive failed to change the politics of Gaza. Now, as we know, the very idea of political Islam causes panic in these Western governments who deport Palestinian professors and lock up Egyptian lawyers, withdraw from UN bodies that recognize Palestine, forbid demonstrations against the Gaza war, and send billions of dollars of military aid to Israel for occupation and repression. But actually, that's a small bubble, amplified by the Western press. In what I call the rest of the world, that is us and the majority of the world, there is admiration for Hamas, for their courage and their resistance struggle for Palestinian national rights. As Azam said this morning, we believe in justice. And Maha said the same sort of thing. What we're really talking about here is universal struggles over rights and justice. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Victoria, for that extremely clear and concise account of Hamas. The final speaker on the platform is Dr. Daud Abdullah. He is the director of the Middle East Monitor at the moment. He has a long-standing record in the Palestine solidarity movement, and he is, in my view, one of the clearest and most articulate voices that movement possesses. Dr. Daud Abdullah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, John. The question posed by the organizers is whether the Muslim Brotherhood is a 21st century a colonial response and whether or not it is obsolete. I start with the first part of the proposition. Yes, it came out of a colonial experience. Whether or not it is absolute for the 21st century, I would argue, of course not. And I'll give the reasons. But in terms of the history, I wish to point out that Hassan al-Banna himself was not the founder of many of the ideas which he articulated, but that these ideas came from the 19th century reformers like Al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida. Al-Banna's accomplishment, his distinguished accomplishment, however, was that he was able to translate those ideas and to formulate a popular movement, over a period of time. And that made his contribution historically very significant. Now, what accounted for the birth of the movement and for these ideas which he represented, which he articulated? There were two factors. Internally, there was a question of tyranny, corruption, disunity. Externally, there was the issue of foreign domination, hegemony by the British, the French, control over resources. In the case of Egypt, the Suez Canal. Now, although we speak, and the topic was posed as a colonial experience, for accuracy, for the sake of accuracy, Egypt itself was not ruled by the colonial office, but by the foreign office. But it was under occupation for a long period of time. And it was occupied over the immediate cause of the occupation was, of course, control of the Suez Canal. Now, why are we discussing this today? It is because of what happened 2 years ago, the overthrow of the Morsi government and people's conclusion, perhaps rather a hasty conclusion, well, this project has failed, it has no relevance for the 21st century, and we should look for other alternatives. Well, this is not really the case. It's an ongoing process. Every revolution has a counter-revolution, and the situation in the Middle East today is quite fluid. Yeah, and you heard overnight on the last 48 hours, the Saudis are now saying we don't have a problem with the Muslim Brotherhood, but we have a problem with certain individuals. And this is an indicator that, an indicator of how fluid the situation is. And those who think that the situation in Egypt has been, sealed and concluded, I think we have a long way to go before that. Now, in terms of, the experience of the Morsi government and the Brotherhood in Egypt, yes, there may have been mistakes in methodology, in application. But I want to speak about some of the principles which guide the movement and which are, in my view, quite relevant today. But one of the striking features of this is what we call a flexible consistency. In that the movement, and al-Banna himself, taught this, that we adapt to certain situations, certain conditions as they presented themselves, but remain consistent to our principles. Our commitment to justice, our commitment to freedom in Palestine, our commitment to a society free of corruption and tyranny, these principles, we remain firmly adhered to them. However, we allow some flexibility in terms of what we may call something. We would not get too bogged down in titles, in forms, in presentation of issues, but we remain focused on the core principles. Now, freedom and then the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. Now, this is a concept that even al-Banna did not, initiate. The social contract. The social contract, which is, the guiding principle of the modern state, in the nation state. articulated by Rousseau in the 18th century. This concept, we find it in Islam. The first caliph in Islam, Omar Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he said, I am not the best of you, but if I am only placed in authority over you, if I follow the principles of Islam, if I obey God, follow me. If I don't, then do not follow me. So that's the contract between the ruler and the ruled. And so the Muslim Brotherhood envisages a similar contract between the ruler and the ruled. That it is based on respect, on freedom, and adherence to the laws and the constitution of the land. Now, another guiding principle is shura, which of course is well known as democracy, democratic principle of consultation between various parties that govern. So that concept of consultation is also rooted in the theory, in the methodology, and in the practice of the Muslim Brotherhood. And for this reason, I think we cannot dismiss the movement as obsolete when it adheres to a principle like this, which allowed them to win 5 elections in Egypt before the coup, and elections across the Middle East, in Tunis, in Morocco, and Yemen. So these are some of the principles. Now, how successful were we in applying them and in bringing about the change, the necessary change that we thought would come after Mubarak? The problem, it appeared, was that, and this is something that has to be addressed, is how to bring about change from within the system. And this is the Brotherhood's approach. This is the approach adopted in Egypt. Morsi was inside the system now, and he wanted to bring about these changes. But he didn't have the means within the system. The people, when he gave orders, he was ignored. He had no one to implement the orders for him. And he's working within that system. So he couldn't, the process of change stalled. So we have to address, this whole question of how to bring about change from within the system. Now take the case of Venezuela, for example, under Hugo Chavez. When the big merchants, the big businessmen hoarded, commodities and gas, Chavez just took them and threw them in prison. Immediately, he acted with force, with audacity, and swiftly, and he was able to put these businessmen under control. I think in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, we did not respond with similar audacity and with swiftness. And the Brotherhood is notorious for its sloth, for its ability to take decision. We call it the makana, the machinery. It rose but very slowly, and then it gathers pace. And so in Egypt, he didn't demonstrate what Chavez demonstrated in Venezuela, or what Erdogan demonstrated in Turkey against the army and against the judiciary. So I think this is something that has to be looked at in the long term in terms of adapting to the 21st century. There are other issues, of course, like 2 minutes. There are other issues, but one of the flexible things about the Brotherhood, and Victoria was speaking about Hamas, in Palestine, we have a people under occupation, a people seeking liberation. So the Brotherhood in Palestine did not stick to the original structure, and methodology of Egypt. But they developed something that allowed them to carry out, that allowed them to recruit, on a mass scale, because they are a liberation movement as well as a resistance movement. And they had to recruit people, fast to engage in politics and to engage in resistance. So the structure of the Muslim Brotherhood, the original structure that we had in Egypt, it was not applicable or functional in a satisfactory manner in Palestine. And so Hamas had to, create its own structure, while remaining rooted in the tradition and the beliefs and the ideology of the Brotherhood. They developed something new. And this is my argument about flexible consistency. There's no contradiction between what Hamas believes and what the Brotherhood believes. But it's the application, and that there's the peculiar circumstances of Palestine, allowed them and dictated that they had to adopt, a different tactic. Now, of course, there are other issues, I think, which, when the right time comes, we will have to revisit these. A lot of people are in prison today, and it is not fair, to speak about certain things while our brothers are being tortured in this manner. But there will come a time, and no doubt this discussion about change within the movement, there's a long debate about the conservative elements and the reformist elements within the movement, the youth wing and the elders. In time, that will be resolved. The issues of structures, I think, no doubt will have to be addressed. The Brotherhood, it has this notorious method of recruitment, where you have to go through certain stages, levels, education and then organization, and then being thrown into the field. That type of long drawn out process may have to be revisited if we are going to engage in politics in the 21st century. Or what is the role of the guidance council, for example, and the people on the ground? All of these issues, structural issues, will have to be addressed, but there's no doubt that in principle and ideals and objectives of the Brotherhood, it's as relevant today as it was when it was founded in 1928. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, we have some brief time now, and it will be because the organisers are to close at 20 past. So please, if you have questions, make them short and to the point, and we'll get them all in. Let me take two or three at a time, and then I'll ask you to come back to directly. Anybody else? Okay, well, while you're thinking about it, do you want to just respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I think that in terms of when obviously first Muslim Brotherhood members came to Britain, they came with the kind of mentality and ideology of what they've been living in their countries. But at the same time, they had that principle which I mentioned, the principle of being able to adapt and so on, and flexibility. And in fact, one of the things that, again, Dino, who writes about the Muslim Brothers, is that's one of their probably most inept characteristics, their ability to be flexible. But initially when they came, without doubt, Britain was a different scenario. There's not, pre to 9/11, things were not scrutinized. Everybody was speaking what they wanted. There was no real, no issues of what you wanted to say and expression. I think after 9/11, there was obviously moves to try and, actually monitor and censor what people spend. And I think the Muslim Brotherhood, but not just the Muslim Brotherhood, probably just all Muslims in general, had to change to actually give their message across. So even organizations that maybe were quite vocal in speaking about the concept of democracy probably softened down very much. People's, in terms of the whole dialogue of change and how it can be participate, and even organizations which initially started off as just student organizations, for example, found itself that, look, we're no longer students here. We have families, we're part of society, we're now British. So we have to actually adapt to that, and that's why you find that there was a change even in the type of societies that were present, from maybe predominantly active within universities and colleges to becoming more active in community, then taking a more interest in media and politics and so on. So definitely, as the society has progressed in terms of third and fourth generation Muslims, there has been more of a sense that, look, we are British, we have a role to play in society, and there's so much that we can offer.
Thanks very much. Any more questions?
Thank you very much. I just would like to express my thought. I am Osama al-Tikriti, father of Anas, and I was a leader of the Islamic Party in Iraq. My English is not to the standard, but anyway, I am not worrying about the future of Islam or Muslim Brotherhood. I am worrying about the future of the democracy. I feel that we are in need, a real need, to protect the democracy, the real democracy, because it is eroded every now and then. And the devil politicians would like to do that because they feel now the nation is their goal to affect. Now they would like to make constitutions in order to limitate the effect of the nation and the future of what the politician would like to do. Therefore, we are in a real danger about the democracy, and I think if we would like to go on for the future, or for a good future for the whole world, we should talk about this, and definitely the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islam is protected by God, and He is the one who can deal with them. But I think the democracy is our job to find out why those people are going on to destroy the democracy in their behavior and in their new constitutions time by time. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, maybe we'll just see if there's any more questions, and then I'll come. I'll bring you back to that. Anybody else? Yes, go on.
Yeah, I would like to know how the panel will view the contribution of the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK regarding the political situation that we are facing here in this country, or maybe the wider European, and or the Muslim Brotherhood is only working toward the Middle East area.
Okay. Victoria, do you want to come back on that question, and then Daud, if you'd answer the second one, that would be great.
Yeah, I would. I really appreciated the question because I'm like you. I'm worried about the future of democracy, and I think the main thing that's happened is the fact that, particularly in the United States, but increasingly here, politics has been captured by big business. In America, you can only run for Congress if you have enormous sums of money, and you get those sums of money by promising to do X, Y, and Z. And if you look at, I won't go into the Obama catastrophes, but every single one of them has been about lobbies, mainly about money, but also some political lobbies. And we increasingly see the same thing in Britain. We've only got to read the HSBC scandal of the last 2 or 3 days. And the fact that the chief guy is sitting in the House of Lords and is not embarrassed. You know, when I was young, when people did something wrong, politicians resigned. Famously, they went to work in the East End to atone for having made terrible mistakes. This has gone away because ethics has no place in our political system. And I find it very interesting that one of the things about the Muslim Brotherhood is the constant emphasis on ethics. So that's really all I can say, that you're right to be worried. But the fact that you now have resistance to this kind of thing in Greece, increasingly in Spain, and in this country, the main political parties are so discredited that who knows now what is going to happen in the next election. because, I mean, you have lots of young people here, but mostly young people are completely turned off by politics. So they're at a loss, and people are looking for guidance, and I think they're looking for moral guidance. Thank you.
Daud, I'll give a response to the second question.
In terms of what the Brotherhood has done in the United Kingdom, it goes back several decades in a number of areas. I think first of all, educationally, and in terms of presenting an enlightened view of Islam to the European people, you know, that it is not just about rituals, but that this is a way of life rooted in a rich civilization, and that Muslims are by no means alien to European civilization, but they were part of the builders of it. That type of, you know, educational process, I think the Brotherhood institutions and organizations in Britain have contributed to it over, you know, and the organizations are many. Then it has worked, you know, arduously on campuses, you know, and through several other institutions, Masajid, in helping young people to stay on the what we call the moderate path. So we wouldn't get distracted to, you know, some of the ideologies, you know, that have taken a lot of our young people today into places like Iraq and Syria. Have we been successful entirely? No, I concede that we have not been successful. It's a very, you know, vicious struggle on campuses today between, you know, the tendencies, you know, the very violent extremist tendencies, and those who try to present the moderate view of the Muslim Brotherhood on campuses. Unfortunately, there is a concerted effort on the part of the government and certain think tanks and the media to malign the Brotherhood, and so keep them out of campuses. They call them extremist preachers and so on, and to the detriment, you know, of the society as a whole. But I refer you back to what Azam, you know, the example he gave about Finsbury for Masjid. When they wanted to you know, reclaim that piece of ground and all the youth who go to that mosque, they turned to the Muslim Brotherhood because they know they had the ability, the influence, you know, to not only administer the premises, but to put the young people in that area on a correct course. Another important thing I think we contributed to in the United States, of course, is participation in politics. You know, to voice our concerns. The invasion of Iraq, you know, the occupation of Palestinian land. We make it known, clear, you know, to the establishment and to the British public what the Muslim Brotherhood thinks about these things. That injustice is injustice. The occupation is occupation. War of aggression is war of aggression. And we did this not by ourselves, but by forming alliances and working with partners in Stop the War, you know, and other, you know, progressive sectors of the British society. And I think that is a significant contribution.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are going to have to bring it to a halt there because the time's running out.